Good afternoon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Women and Girls Foundation's web show, In the Movement. I'm your host, Camila Rivera-Tinsley, and each month we will be interviewing incredible people who are working towards creating a more sustainable and equitable future with conversations focused on gender, racial, and environmental justice. This month, I'm honored and excited to join my guest, Tiffany Taulton. She and I are going to be discussing her work in the sustainability world and how it impacts Pittsburgh and beyond. So, Tiffany, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I am going to start us off by just asking, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me, and I will try my best to tell you a little. I'm usually better at telling people a lot.
Okay.
Um, so my name's Tiffany Taulton. I'm currently the Director of Community Visioning and Adaptation for Connect, which stands for the Congress of Neighboring Communities. Um, I was I just started this recently, so I'm excited about that. And how I came to this is long road, I think. But like many people, it's a pretty windy road as well. So I was born in Pittsburgh. My dad's family is from Clareton. And so as a kid, I traveled all over the place. We lived in Florida, we lived in Puerto Rico. My early schooling was there. We lived in Virginia for a bit. And then finally, we ended up in Vermont. So that's where I went to high school. So I've been exposed to a lot of different environments from, Still Mill Town as a baby. So not too many memories except for Christmas visits, to the tropics of Florida and Puerto Rico, to the snow and mountains of Vermont. And then, I've lived a lot of places as well on my own. I went to school at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., did my bachelor's program there in foreign studies. So, really looking at international relations, specifically in Latin America. I lived in Costa Rica for a part of that time as well, doing at the University of Costa Rica, studying political science. I then worked as an English teacher, so I had an education background for a while. I did I, I was said to be an ESL teacher, but most of my students actually were children of immigrants who spoke perfect English but had learning disabilities that were going undiagnosed. So
Wow.
I spent several years doing that actually. I was a hospital interpreter for a time as well, for a couple of years. I ended up, when there was one of the many economic downturns, I ended up moving to New York and working at a law firm. Ended up teaching English in New York as well, and then finally went to Taiwan and taught English there, um, oftentimes with children that had undiagnosed learning disabilities the same, and went taught English in France, then ended up working at the United Nations, as one does when you've lived in so many countries and you speak 5 different languages.
Oh my goodness.
Um, and while I was in New York, really one of the big focuses of the United Nations at that time was the Millennium Development Goals. And with my travel experience, I really latched onto the environmental topic and the education topics and the connections between the environment, education, and health. And that came to a head when Superstorm Sandy struck New York City. And so that was really a turning point for me where talking about the environment became something that was less theoretical. It was less about the future and, those people over there in Asia or in Africa, those people that are so unfortunate, they're going to be impacted. And we, the fortunate ones in the United States, we need to do more to help and make sure this doesn't happen. It became immediate as I was sitting there in a black blackout in New York City, in the winter, and it's cold and everything's wet and it's flooded and stores are shut down and my credit card doesn't work, so I can't buy food, and the subways are flooded, so I'm wondering how I'm going to get around. And I'm thinking, here I am in supposedly one of the richest countries in the world, in one of the richest cities in the world, with Wall Street down and everything else. And climate change isn't a problem for somebody over there. It's not a problem for some time in the future. It's a problem right now, right here. And time is running out for us to keep having meetings about it and talking. And so as much as I loved my job at the United Nations, I really felt I had to get out and do something more. I needed to be more on the ground. I felt at the time that my work talking to people just wasn't enough, and that in a disaster, I should have some solid skills. And when I looked around, the people that I saw doing the work were the permaculture community. They were the
Yeah.
people teaching people how to get food, how to forage food, how to grow food. Immediately in the aftermath, they were sharing food. They were making mutual aid societies and going up flights of stairs in buildings that didn't have working elevators and getting people care and medicine and food and blankets. They were the people that were teaching people how to filter water, how to cook their food without electricity. And so I became really involved in the permaculture community. I got a permaculture design certificate. I went to meetings of the permaculture group. I started leading meetings of the permaculture group and going to meetings at the city, and where they would have all these planning meetings to build New York City back better and to plan for the future. And I was just really struck by the contrast of who was affected by this climate disaster, by Superstorm Sandy, the areas that were flooded, the areas that were cut off from transportation, and the makeup of the rooms that I was in. And it's New York City, so you can have some very, very large meetings. I mean, there'd be 500 people in a room for a meeting, a planning meeting. And I would look around the room and I'd see maybe 5 people that looked like me. And meanwhile, we're talking about the communities of people that look like me, but they weren't in the room. And a lot of the suggestions were these ideas of, oh, well, we can put oysters out there and we can create these sand dunes and we'll have this ecological restoration that will keep the water from coming in, which sounds really beautiful, just lovely nature, natural solution, biodiversity, and it's great. And then you think about, like, well, if you put these oysters out, like, that sounds kind of expensive, and, like, how are you gonna pay for that, And then, of course, the idea is, well, we'll just build these super tall apartment buildings that are near it, and these luxury condos, they'll pay for, this nice, scape that's gonna protect us from climate change, which still sounds really silly because you're like, well, the water's getting higher, so it's good. We should build some apartments next to it. But then you think, well, there are people currently living there. Um, and they're not going to be able to afford these luxury apartments that are going to pay for these oysters and clamshells and everything else. So what happens to them? And it's just like, well, they'll find a place to go. Which is, you know, I guess something to say if you're not one of the people that lives there or someone that doesn't have a family member that lives there. And so that really brought me to this thought that I just felt very alone in a way. You're surrounded by 500 people and you feel like nobody sees you. And you feel like your community's forgotten. And I started thinking, nothing's going to happen if I don't do it myself. So I need to get more involved, and I can't just talk about we need to do something. Like, I need to do something. So I, really started trying to learn how to farm. I actually got trained as a birth doula at the time as well, because one of the enduring images for me of Superstorm Sandy was seeing the hospital flooded near the river, not too far from the United Nations, actually. And because all of the emergency equipment had been located in the basement, again next to a river, they had to evacuate. And I just remember seeing so many babies being taken out and like the nurses like hand pumping air into them, and the stories of the women who weren't able to go to the hospital because they were, cut off from public transportation. The ferries were shut down. There were elevators and they were afraid to go down a dark hall and a dark stairwell. And I just felt like, maybe everybody should become a doula so you can help the people in your neighborhood while you're there. And those were the thoughts that I had. I started making my exit plan to leave New York at that time because I felt also that strain that my family is here in Pittsburgh and Clairton. And when you have a disaster of that magnitude, a lot of times the phone lines are shut down or they're just overburdened and you can't get in touch with people. The buses aren't working, so you can't get to your loved ones. They don't know what's going on with you. If they need help, you can't help them. And the federal government, the state government, even the city government, when the disaster is of that magnitude, it takes them a long time to get to you. It might be a week, it might be a month, it might be 3 months in some cases. And in some cases, as I saw, when Puerto Rico underwent the same kind of situation with Maria, it could be a year, and after a year, the government just decides that your community is not worth, going to fix, and you just end up being abandoned or removed from the official count. It was a turning point for me being in Superstorm Sandy and just recognizing the importance of the climate crisis as a now issue, a me issue, and not as somebody over there some point in the future issue. And that's really what brought me to that point, and brought me to coming back to Pittsburgh, where I hadn't been since I'd been 6 months old. Um, and getting to, I got involved first with the permaculture community here in Pittsburgh. Black Urban Farmers and Gardeners Co-op was just forming at that time, which was, a really fun thing for me because I'd been involved in the group in New York where it started. So to come to Pittsburgh and see it wasn't just a New York thing was pretty exciting. And getting involved, volunteering with that. It so happened that the Bugs Co-op was informed of a city planning meeting where they were going to be talking about farming and they needed somebody to go because, again, oftentimes we're not represented in those spaces. Um, and I went and I realized that city planning was actually a great place to it was something I never actually thought considered. I didn't know city planning existed as a profession, as something that people did. I never thought about the fact that cities were planned a certain way, and going to that meeting was eye-opening. And I actually asked them if I could be there more, and they suggested that I become an intern, which was nice because at the time, I didn't know that you could be an intern when you weren't in school. Um, and I ended up liking it so much that it became a turning point in my career. When I joined city planning as an intern, at that time, Pittsburgh was undergoing its Pittsburgh Climate Action Plan 3.0. And I became very involved in writing the food chapter of that and contributing to other chapters on ecosystem services, and just the underlying history of Pittsburgh and the environment. And I was uh, prodded, it was strongly suggested at that time that I go to grad school at CMU, which was not on my radar. I was just trying to get a job at that point. I moved to Pittsburgh, I had family to take care of. But I was invited to sit in on a class, an environmental policy class with Matthew Mahalik. Many of you know him from the Breathe Collaborative. And he's such a fabulous teacher that I ended up applying to CMU and going to the Heinz College for public policy and management. Um, and that was a great career move for me. Really opened my eyes to some things that had changed since I first went to college. Some of the science had changed, and that was, a surprise to think about science changing, but also to think about the continuity because it became evidence. When you're a non-traditional student in a classroom with younger students, um, it's interesting sometimes when you see information presented and everyone is astonished by it. And then you're thinking, I saw the same information. It's the same thing that was happening in the 80s. This isn't new.
Yeah.
Um, so it was interesting to be able to give my perspective in class that way, and then to graduate and end up actually working in one of the communities where I'd done 3 studies at CMU, which was Hazelwood. I'd had 3 specific classes dedicated to the new development of Hazelwood, where the brownfield, where the last remaining steel mill in the city of Pittsburgh had operated in the Hazelwood community, and had been shut down in the late 90s. And now the brownfield site was being redeveloped into the newest technology center for Pittsburgh. And there was a big fear that that would gentrify the community there, which was extremely low income and racially diverse. And so that was that was really my jump in into environmental work in Pittsburgh. You know, we planted over 700 trees during the 4 years that I was with Hazelwood Initiative. We got many grants, including a Climate Cup Challenge recognition at the United Nations COP26 in Scotland.
It's very, 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 very rare that I ever meet another woman of color who is a certified permaculturist. So I am a certified permaculturist, and I was doing similar work at probably similar times. And I hardly ever talk about it because I always feel like when I start talking about those things, people glaze over and they have no idea what I mean or that impact. And so you just don't know how good it does my heart as another woman of color to be like, yes, there is someone who sees the world so much the way that I see the world. And so you're just making me feel really, really good. And I hope some of the other permaculturists that might tune in, that might be women of color, I hope they will find their space too and feel just as seen as I do right now. You are now with Connect. What is Connect, and what about Connect and its mission got you excited to move over into that space?
There are just a lot of things that we were working on, during my time at Hazelwood Initiative to make a community healthier and to make a community more climate resilient. I was contacted, to do more of that work. First I became an adjunct professor at Duquesne University, speaking about environmental justice and just trying to get, younger people to understand this and inviting them to the community to plant trees, to see how we can do things sustainably there, and to prepare for the future. Connect has given me an opportunity to bring that resource, to bring my skills in helping communities get resources to improve themselves to more communities. And my job specifically is to work with communities on creating a community vision, speaking with them to understand what their needs are and trying to put those together into larger projects. Connecting, right? It's not just our community needs a store. It's not just our community would like some gardens. It's not just we have a heat island effect. It's looking at it holistically and saying, well, how does not having green space affect your heat? How does not having gardens affect your heat? How does that affect your stormwater? How can you use gardens to create a store? Making these holistic visions for the community and looking wider to say, well, if your community is experiencing this problem, what about the one next to you? What about the one on the other side? Maybe if we all go together, we can apply for the grant together. And instead of fighting each of us for a piece of the pie, we can show that the need is great enough that we need to enlarge this pie and everybody will benefit from that. What I'm excited about to be joining Connect, to have this opportunity to impact more people, to create a cohesive vision for the region when it comes to climate change, and climate resilience, and making sure that people, regardless of where they live, what their ethnic background is, where they come from, because, we are experiencing people coming from other states or even other countries coming to this region, that everybody is able to be safe, that their needs are seen, and that they are protected, and that we're working together on this.
Thank you so much for sharing what gets you excited about joining Connect. And I'm so glad that you are poised to be able to impact a million people. And I have no doubts that with your skills and your talents and your passion, that you will expand even that reach for Connect. And so, this month is Women's History Month, and you are a person that is making history right now. So you are a rock star in my eyes. Honestly, if you ever feel like your wings are, you're drooping or your crown is a little bit to the side, you just need to let me know, because I will remind you just how amazing you are, and just how important you are to Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, and honestly to the entire world. Is there anything else that you would like to share with anyone who happens to be tuning in today?
I guess the main thing I would like to say is that sometimes people think that they can't get involved in this movement, that they're not the right person or they don't have the skills. And I just want to say there's a place for all of us. At the end of the day, it's not just about the scientists, it's not just about the engineers, it's not just about the carpenters. And yes, they are important, but everybody has a voice. It was a surprise to me to find out that the ability to speak was actually quite important. That there are a lot of people, especially scientists, that will give really great information and they don't know how to deliver it in a way that people can understand. And so, me being on the back end of that, I did my internship when I was at CMU. I did my internship at the Environmental Defense Fund in New York, and I was the only person who came from like the policy background. Everybody else on the team were engineers and environmental scientists. And I was the one that had to bring them together to actually write the policy because it wasn't understandable to a layperson. In other cases, when I was volunteering in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, it was really the artists that were making the change, that were making people aware of what was going on. They had these murals that were going on that showed the work. And I remember I was at Casa Pueblo and at Juntas. And for those that aren't familiar with Casa Pueblo is just a wonderful organization. And they saved a lot of people's lives in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria because they had solar panels on their buildings. They were one of the few places, and they'd had solar panels for like 20 something years. And so they were able to have these mini refrigerators and keep people's medicines cool, to help people get connected with the outside world, to have food and all of that. And the reason that they had that is because back in the day when they started, and they were fighting a mining operation, they tried to have an environmental meeting about mining, and almost no one showed up. But then they started having these workshops about their collective history, their cultural history. And they said, hey, if this mine comes in, they're going to cut down all the trees. And those trees are the trees that we use to make our drums, the drums that make our music, the drums that our ancestors communicated with, the drums that fuel the rhythm in our blood. And as they started holding these drum making workshops and these drumming workshops and these dancing workshops, more people started to come to these cultural meetings that became environmental meetings because we had to protect the forest, to protect our culture and our history and our community. And so there is a place for everyone in this movement for environmental justice, for climate justice, for communities that are healthy and sacred and that stay together and celebrate their history. And so people shouldn't feel like they can't do something. Everyone can do something. Think about what you are good at and take your first step there.
What a wonderful way to end this discussion, and just a call to people to value themselves and to value their contribution. And I truly, truly love that. So again, thank you for joining us. You can find more information about the work of WGF at wgfpa.org. And Tiffany, how can people connect with you if they want to follow your work and support you?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn, Tiffany Taulton. And they can also follow the work of Connect and my work there at Connect Govs. That's GOVS, connectgovs.org.
Thank you again, and have a really wonderful afternoon. And I hope to bump into you out in these streets here. Um,
Definitely will. Thank you.
all right, Tiffany, thank you.